Sorry.
It's okay. We'll work out technical difficulties.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Yeah. Maybe share the link to my LinkedIn as well, so I can.
Yes,
so I will. Reshare it. Okay, let's see then. Okay, we're live.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're live. Excellent. Okay.
We're live.
Yeah. I was going to say, if you want to go ahead and share this to my LinkedIn, I'll post it on there as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll share it now. On your LinkedIn now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll do it. I'm not sure if I can share it on. I'll send you the link on LinkedIn.
Excellent.
Yeah, I've invited. Let me just add to my brother as well. It's lagging. I think it's his internet program.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's lag. I think internet's been quite bad everywhere, really.
Yeah, but in Portugal, internet tends to be faster than UK because all of Portugal has a lot of fiber optic, and most people in Portugal live in in apartments.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of fiber optic. I'll send you the link now.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, for LinkedIn.
Oh. Okay, when it comes up, I'm sure it'll come up soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Definitely.
Okay.
So there are a few friends
which we make a start.
Which are connected now. So
yeah, cool.
So we should be able to get some likes as well. And the idea is that I'm going to download this as well, and perhaps put it into a more friendly format. So first of all, let me thank you. Let's start. Let me thank you to and basically explain why Flavio Inocencio it's now with Darren Cooper, and why we're doing this live together, basically. The idea is that this is going to be a kind of interview, a kind of a small talk between me and Aaron. For people that don't know, I met Aaron in 2016, so I've been friends with Aaron since 2016 when I joined Coventry University. And Aaron was the one that initially created the idea for the Masters in Oil, Gas and Energy at Coventry University. I joined later as a more oil and gas guy. Aaron knows about the oil and gas industry, but is also has a lot of expertise in terms of sustainability, in terms of environmental law, in terms of corporate social responsibility. So very interesting were the debates that we had for 2 years while we were both the directors of oil, gas, and energy, and the feedback from students and from staff was very good. So it's a pity that the Masters no longer exists as a separate program, but our view in terms of oil and gas and energy was always a kind of a whole view, a holistic view.
Indeed it was.
Oil and gas as a sustainable way, and something that in the long term, obviously, countries are going to go to a more sustainable exploration and to a kind of a renewable sources of energy. Of course, oil doesn't compete with renewables in everything, but our view was very, very similar. contrary to what most people believed. Our views were very convergent. And me and Aaron, we publish also a chapter together on the joint operating agreement, basically in English law. Aaron actually was very good on that, because Aaron, his English skills are very good in terms of writing skills. It's something that I always liked. So Aaron is an amazing guy. Hi Eduardo. Eduardo is a friend. He's an advisor to the Council of Ministers in Angola. So he's also a lawyer. So he just joined us on Facebook as well.
Excellent.
So some people are going to see it afterwards. Some are going to join us live. This is just going to be a kind of a pilot test, and hopefully we are going to do more interesting talks in the future. Something me and Aaron. So basically, this is going to be an interview of me to Aaron, and then it's going to be a kind of a conversation, because most people aren't aware of what we did at Coventry. When I tell people in Lisbon, even in Angola, that I was the associate director of the LLM in oil, gas, and energy, most people assume it's only oil and gas. It's about pollution. It's about CO2. But the environment, corporate social responsibility, things like corruption, were at the forefront of the modules at Coventry University. So it's really a pity that Coventry didn't continue with the masters, with more kind of modules. So we had a lot of plans. Also, we brought in, during those 2 years, a lot of top experts in the world. People from London, different people from the States, and people from different countries. I even brought a guy from Angola, from our national company. So the idea is here is basically talk about the oil and gas industry, and to talk about the energy transition, the idea of sustainability, and the idea of what is going to be the future of the industry. So most people are going to see this afterwards, not during the live stream. So hopefully it's going to be an amazing conversation. So the first question I'm going to ask Aaron. Aaron now is pursuing his PhD at University of East Finland. Aaron has a lot of publications about the environmental law, about the protection of the Arctic. He also has published widely now. Let's put it that way, in oil, gas, energy. Let's put it that way. And he recently organized a conference on Guyana. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to contribute with the paper, but Aaron is published at OGEL. OGEL is the Oil and Gas and Energy Law journal, which it's one of the top in the industry. Aaron has published there before, and he was the co-editor with Daria Shapalova, who she's a doctor at Aberdeen University. So Aaron is actually a guy that can bring this kind of expertise, which I think most people don't know. Even my students in Portugal, Aaron, just to let you know, aren't aware of the many things I did in the UK. This is one, a lot of my colleagues here in Lisbon during my time here weren't aware. They just think oil and gas is a kind of, it's about the guys, it's about Chevron, Exxon, Shell. Forget about things like local content, protection of the environment, environmental law, climate change litigation, legislation, anti-corruption or anti-bribery. So basically, I want you to talk about that, particularly after COVID-19. So Aaron, this is going to be a test pilot, so the floor is yours now.
Yeah, sure. So then, obviously, guys, welcome to our chat, our conversation. Like Flavio said, a lot of this is going to be kind of shooting from the hip, as many of our discussions were when we shared an office at Coventry University, when we were the co-directors of the Oil, Gas, and Energy Law LLM. And it's interesting, really, like how this kind of started. We have looked at doing projects together in the past, and obviously now something is finally coming to fruition. So I'm very good to be here. Very happy to be here. I'm very happy to reach out to the audience. So guys, we find ourselves in a rather interesting place. I mean, in terms of the oil, gas, and energy industry, it finds itself being hit by a kind of multitude of these different waves now. One of the and by waves I mean that in the metaphorical sense. But so in the one sense, obviously we saw with the Russia OPEC deal. Obviously, that hit Brent crude. We had the oversupply, and then we have this COVID crisis, which obviously has altered production, and obviously how oil gas facilities operate. So we see less shipping. We've seen less shipping. We've seen operations come to a temporary standstill. And I mean, this is kind of, and this has had quite a dangerous and quite a severe effect on the economy, as we've all seen. There have been hundreds of job losses, and this is, I suppose, one of the consequences of such an aggressive form of capitalism, which we see now in the global economy. Anything less than 2% growth is a complete disaster, and it's just everything comes to a stop. People lose jobs, and obviously we dip into recession. But that's another question that we'll get to, that no doubt we'll get to later. We find then that it's in an interesting place, oil and gas, at this moment in time. I mean, now we're seeing energy companies, the oil majors, etc. They are broadening their horizons. They are embracing this trend to becoming broader energy companies, to embrace this change to a green transition. And obviously, this is something which is lurking over everybody's minds, and it's in international discourse. It's in business economics. Climate change, the threat of climate change, and environmental degradation, and the actual costs of that, the cost of environmental degradation, as it were. And it is a consequence of obviously burning fossil fuels. We burn fossil fuels, we emit carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide goes up into the atmosphere. It retains heat that's radiated from the sun. Some of that heat is radiated back into space. Some of that heat is held on the planet, which in the atmosphere, which obviously contributes to the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is what obviously helps us live, helps us breathe, produces oxygen, etc. So it's something that we all have to, those of us that work in the oil, gas, and energy industry, those of us that represent oil, gas, and energy, oil, gas, and broader energy companies, have to take that into consideration. In this age of environmentalism, there are going to be huge consequences economically and socially for not addressing the negative impacts of burning fossil fuels, and of course of land use. Because although, and I will say this in the oil and gas industry's defense, even though it does contribute to climate change, and overall contributes to the overall emissions of climate change on the planet and in the atmosphere. It's not all down to oil and gas. It is not all down to oil and gas. Oil and gas is only a percentage of those total emissions. The total emissions, obviously, there are a multitude of different layers, because this is a very complex problem that we are dealing with. The whole idea of climate change and the acceleration in warmth, it's a complex problem. It is a complex problem. I don't want to say the science isn't certain, because it more or less is. It is more or less certain, and it is more or less settled. We can model. It's how we predict. Obviously, there is a degree of uncertainty, but where this is concerned, the consequences of not doing something are more drastic, even for oil companies and even for oil majors, those that make money like water, like spring, like those that make money like water comes out of a tap. It's something which has to be dealt with. It's something that has to be dealt with. It's something that we as oil, gas, and energy companies have to mitigate. We have to mitigate the negative consequences of the actions, and that means whether it means employing more effective environmental impact assessments, whether it means monetizing things like waste gas and using things like waste gas for different for alternative purposes, whether it means moving into the extractive industries in terms of mining, for things like silica, copper, nickel, cadmium, all those components of batteries, gold, silver. I'm sure many of you have noticed that the price of gold is rather favorable for those of you that are investing in gold, like myself. And as an environmentalist, I probably shouldn't admit to that, but hey ho. So yes, so it's it is a very interesting time that we find ourselves in, especially with the slowdown, a slowdown of the global economy, because we are seeing knock-on effects of COVID, and the kind of wider effects of COVID are that, not the wider effects, the more micro level effects rather than the macro level effects. The micro level effects are that we are seeing less people use transportation. Less people are using transportation, or less people using transportation because more people are biking, more people are cycling. Infrastructure is changing. Big plans are being made for infrastructure changes around many towns and cities. However, this is kind of at odds with each other because governments are encouraging people to not use public transport because, of course, the threat of the spread of the disease, or the threat of the spread of the disease, as it were. So it's interesting. There are many different contradictions that we see through national governments, which will have an effect on things like the price of oil, the demand for oil, demand for transportation, etc. This is all something that needs to be mitigated, needs to be controlled, and there needs to be action now rather than later. Because, of course, the costs of adaptation are going to be a lot more expensive than the costs of mitigation, whether that be through building or technological solutions to certain negative consequences of the actions of oil companies, or whether it be through case law work, because we are seeing a growing rise in case law and climate case law related to state level emissions, and obviously obligations to things like the Paris Agreement, and obligations to just the wider considerations of society. And this is where, like Flavio was talking about earlier, bringing in this idea of companies being socially responsible, and then and of course giving back in the right way, because we can't obviously greenwash, we can't greenwash, and we can't fake it. Essentially, you can't fake it. This is one of those things that we can't fake. With social media now, we have so many different ideas, or we have so many different ways in which mediums can be communicated, or information can be communicated through these various different mediums. So if there are certain actions which are conducted, then you can guarantee that it's going to be a PR nightmare for whichever oil company you represent, or whichever oil company you happens to be dealing with a particular incident. It's going to be absolutely just excuse me a second. Sorry about that, folks. It looks like Dr. Inocencio's computer is encountering some technical difficulties, which is not ideal, but it's a sign of the times that we live in. It is certainly a sign of the times that we live in. Now, one of the things that I did want to talk about, obviously, today was this idea of it being an opportunity, the transition being an opportunity for oil, gas, and the broader energy companies. Obviously, Statoil, as an example, Statoil has now become Equinor to represent a broader, more environmentally friendly approach to extraction, which is spurious to say the least. But in terms of that, I did want to add. I did want to add this idea about the transition and what the general perception of the transition is. You look at groups like Extinction Rebellion, who demand immediate change, demand declarations of climate emergencies and such. But on that subject, we see these declarations of climate emergencies. There are many governments and state representatives saying, yes, there is a climate emergency. Yes, we must do something about it. But what have we seen? Absolutely nothing. But what does that mean? What does that mean for, or what does that mean for essentially the energy, and what does that mean for the oil industry? Obviously, that means absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Well, I say absolutely nothing. It does mean that there has to be a certain degree of responsibility taken. Hello, Dr. Inocencio. There has to be a certain degree of responsibility taken. But this idea of governments and state officials declaring climate emergencies and this kind of business essentially mean, and with the lack of action, that essentially means that we, as oil and gas companies, can breathe a slight sigh of relief, because we don't see, because even though perhaps there is a level of divestment away from the oil and gas and oil resources and assets, if you have a look at demand from nations like Russia, you have a look at demand from nations like China. China is still heavily reliant on coal. If you look at continents, if you look at energy demand for Africa, still the majority of energy supply comes from your fossil fuels. It does not come from your renewables. So even though renewables are growing, they are accelerating, there is no question as to where still key supply lies, because of its cost, its access, and how easy it is to access. So climate change and us as the industry, or oil and gas as the industry, is something that, one, it's the elephant in the room, in the sense that, yes, we have to admit that there is a direct consequence. There is a direct consequence of the burning of fossil fuels. More often than not, there is negative consequences in terms of land use. Just look at Bodo, Nigeria, and Shell. There are instances of wells that aren't being tapped off properly. And there isn't the appropriate security to ensure, where pipelines are concerned, to ensure that there isn't any what's the word I'm looking for? Sabotage, either sabotage or piracy or pipe piracy, as it were, to steal the oil as it flows through. Flavio, feel free to stop me at any time to ask any questions as well. Or
so, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So the first question I'll ask you, it's basically a question that most students pose, and it's about the real size of renewables in the energy mix. I think you have shown that one of the issues is that a lot of demand for fossils now is coming from Asia. It's coming from these emerging markets, because most OECD countries, which includes the most industrialized countries in the world, Western Europe, basically North America and Japan, basically are mature countries for these oil majors. But I know that fossils are still 80% of the energy mix, and the rest, it's renewables, it's hydroelectric, it's nuclear. So in Portugal, most people assume that solar is huge, but actually solar and wind, it's about 3%.
Yeah.
Actually quite small on a global scale. So the issue is how can, let's say, I have many people here on my Facebook that work in the oil and gas industry, people that work at Chevron, Exxon, people that come from an oil-producing nations, people from Mozambique, people from Angola, from Nigeria. So how can you prepare these economies for a kind of the energy transition? Because eventually it will happen as well in those kind of regions. So what?
Yeah, I mean, in those regions and emerging regions or emerging economies, I mean, this was a question that we discussed many times in terms of how there is the opportunity for these nations to leapfrog certain stages of development. What you would kind of associate with development in terms of like the kind of industrial revolution, and I know that is a very westernized perspective on how development should occur, but this, in terms of how a transition could be or potentially could be facilitated, subsidies have to be cut and they have to be redirected into more cleaner and greener technologies, or there has to be increasing investment from the oil majors into these technologies as they adopt a broader image of becoming an energy company, rather than focusing on broader oil and gas.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for let's say a new country like Ghana now that is producing about 200k of BPD, of barrels of oil per day, how can how can they approach? It's a new producer. It's a country actually with a good governance. So what are your views on good governance in the oil and gas sector? That's not the thing which I think people, at least in my country, tend to forget. It's the idea that you need also some transparency. You need some very good compliance rules, of corruption. So for instance, if you go to Cabinda, where 50% of the Angolan oil comes from, there is a lot of pollution there, a lot of spills, and it has a detrimental impact on fisheries, also on potential tourism. So how do you see that?
I mean, this is what I mean in terms of it being an opportunity for a national oil company to contribute to the wider society, for it to be a socially responsible company, ensure that it is an advocate and lobbies for the appropriate controls to be put in place. But no, I completely agree in that sense, that for countries like Ghana, that are producers and quickly producing barrels, there needs to be appropriate measures of pollution control. There needs to be appropriate measures concerning the working environments, things like fire and explosion preventions and such like that. Such controls need to be in place. There needs to be a comprehensive system in terms of the actual regulation of the actual operations of the facilities themselves. But then moving on to the kind of looking at the broader governance aspects of it, I suppose one of the best models that you can follow is the Norwegian model for looking at implementing appropriate governance when it comes to like state control, but also that balance between the actual control of that control and the operation of the company itself. So I suppose the follow the Norwegian model, that would be, or follow the Norwegian as best as it possibly can for.
Let me ask you something. Why
system? Yeah.
Why some of these countries don't follow it? Because I'll give you an example. I know people from Angola, even people from Mozambique, that got training in Norway, but these countries don't seem to follow a lot of the Norwegian model in terms of regulatory environment. So what is missing, in your opinion?
I think potentially.
By the way, I just want to tell people that Aaron led a lot of our students to Norway, to Stavanger, to the Museum of Petroleum. So Aaron actually led a lot of students, even non-students that benefited from Coventry University, the kind of visiting for students. And Aaron went to the center of the oil and gas industry in Norway. That's why I'm asking you.
It is an interesting question as to why more people don't follow that. And I think it's a couple of things. Politics, politics, geography. I think geography is an interesting factor that has to be considered in terms of how that shapes the politics of a nation, the geopolitics, as it were. How that shapes how a nation develops in that sense.
But by the way, I just want to tell the audience, for people that don't know Aaron, particularly my Angolan and Portuguese audience, I have a lot of Portuguese students now, and a lot of Brazilians, a lot of people from all over the world. Aaron is a big guy in geography. Actually, I call him is a lawyer, but he's a geographer that actually got a law degree. So for people more scientifically orientated, that's one of the things I miss about Aaron, was our debates on the science behind climate change, behind oil exploration, and even renewables, energy in general.
Because I mean, you have to consider all these things in the shift. It's like we were saying at the start, is that like environmental law, oil, gas, it permeates the economies. Obviously, it's related to geography. It's related to the environment because it's the natural resources, as it were. And there are all these things that have to be considered for you to actually make reasoned decisions moving forward where this concerns and where this situation is concerned. But yeah, and just going back to that idea of tying it into geopolitics and fossils and such. Say again.
Can you explore more on that? Because most people aren't aware. I'm aware of some of the debates, but I think most people are clueless about the oil and gas industry. They only look at it from a legal perspective or from a geology perspective. They don't look at overall issues that relate with economics, with business. I think you can do that to some extent.
Well, one of the primary or one of the sort of developing examples, which I think is probably frames this discussion and illustrates this argument like beautifully, is the Northern Sea route that runs along the northern Russian coast.
Okay.
Now, at the moment, that is not commercially viable. There is still there is still the heavy presence of sea ice. So you are, if you choose to sail that route, you are heavily reliant on Russian icebreakers. So it means Russia exerts most of the control over the Northern Sea route. But projections indicate that once the sea ice recedes, like through climate change, it melts past a certain point, this Northern Sea route will become more commercially viable. This is why there has been quite a heavy degree of development occurring on that particular route. Or that's why the Russians have been exploring and building the Yamal LNG gas plants. They've just and I believe they've just finished construction on LNG the gas plant, Yamal gas plant 2. So there are so in terms of Russian gas, then Russian gas. China is one of the big consumers of Russian.
Can you elaborate a little bit more? Because this semester I had a student from Russia. She's actually on my Facebook, and we had a discussion on Nord Stream and the role of natural gas in the energy mix. Can you talk a little bit, taking Russia as an example about that?
Example. Well, it's interesting. I think Russia is quite obviously a
and by the way,
study.
Okay, let me just explain that Aaron also taught in Russia for many years.
4 years.
Siberia.
Yeah.
So Aaron has a lot of experience with Russia and with Russian higher education as a whole as well.
Yeah, it's fantastic experience. But yeah, going back to the North Sea route then. Obviously, the gas fields on that line the sort of northern coastline of Russia are kind of legacy gas fields, so they're quite old now. But in terms of Russia taking advantage and developing the gas fields on the Yamal Peninsula, there is still quite a lot of development that can occur in terms of shipping, LNG. And one of the things is that this development is being financed by Chinese money. There are a lot of Chinese backers, not as heavy percentage as what you would think, because obviously there is an economic disparity between Russia and between China. So obviously, for those of you that have looked into the geopolitics of this and looked into and examined the kind of strategic partnership which is occurring, it's one of opportunism. China sees it as a way to exert more influence, but then Russia sees it as a way to maintain its authority in the kind of global order, its presence in the global order.
How do you see this relationship? Because apparently Russia will be less dependent on Europe, basically, as a market. So how do you see this shift to the east? Can you?
Well, this is the thing. Because of the European push to become less reliant on Russian gas and Russian gas imports, it still does import quite a degree of or quite a sizable amount of Russian gas. But in order to preserve its kind of position as an energy power, Russia is looking east for Chinese backing. But how do I see it playing out? It will play out as long as it's commercially viable for Russia. As long as Russia benefits, they will maintain that partnership. Because traditionally, Chinese and Russian relations haven't been great. They haven't been great. But there is all this talk of like, President Putin is China's most treasured and special friend and all this kind of business. But it's not. It is strictly business. Okay. And if you have dealt with Russians before, Russians are very my way or the highway kind of thing. So this is a business relationship. That's what it is. It's a commercial relationship. As long as Russia, as long as the relationship keeps presenting opportunities to Russia for it to advance advance itself, its power in terms of energy and its position within energy politics and energy geopolitics, it will maintain that relationship. But otherwise, it will.
Let me ask you something. Can Russia, can US LNG compete with Russia? Because it's very high cost. Not the Americans want that, and in effect, they're energy independent. But in terms of the financials, most of shale is actually bankrupt, is insolvent. I think everybody.
Yeah. This is another consequence of COVID. Another consequence of COVID, and another consequence of the drop in oil prices. Let's face it, that's pretty much decimated shale gas. Shale gas is now done. It's done now. It is done.
This is what people are saying in the industry. That's true.
It's done. It's absolutely done. So, I mean, in terms of perhaps environmentalists could call that a victory for themselves. But it's interesting. But it is really interesting. But no, I think that can it compete, or can the USA compete?
By the way, can I ask you something?
Yes, you can.
I already had those debates in Coventry, and we talk about that all the time. But how do you see shale in the environment? Because last year I went to the summit of APN, the Association of International Petroleum Negotiators, and the topic was shale. And one of the things that you told me at Coventry University, because you did an assessment on that, looking at the scientific literature, was the environmental impact of shale. I was very, very surprised how detrimental it was, how bad it was. I had no idea before you told me. Can you talk about that?
I mean, it depends on the region. Like, of course, it depends upon the region where, like, sort of shale gas exploration is occurring. Because obviously, one of the things with the US, for example, is that they get most of their water from underground aquifers, like pockets of water deep underground. For those of you that have ever dug a well, that's what you're going for. When you dig a well, you're looking for the aquifer to draw the water up. That's what you're looking for. And this is the problem, is that when in order to extract the resources, the water and the chemical compounds which are pumped into the ground are then left underground. This leaches out into the soil. It leaches out into the rock, which then obviously it has a detrimental effect on the water quality in the area. But see, within the UK, it's kind of different. I think it's more of a sort of countryside aesthetic. So nobody wants the countryside destroyed by having this huge, like, derrick drill thing in the middle of a nice field.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, because I mean, where the Lancaster Basin is, it's obviously a very nice and it's a very beautiful area of the country. One that doesn't want to be destroyed. And it's I suppose, again, this is a victory, or the fact that we have now all but abandoned shale gas in the UK. It's a victory for the NIMBYs, the not in my backyards, or the not in my backyarders, as it were. So it's kind of for them.
Nastia, she's. Do you remember? She was your student. Environmental law. She's an engineer. I think she's did environmental law as well, and environment. She's asking about the Nigerian and the shell disaster in the delta, in the Niger Delta, basically. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because a lot of the production in the Niger Delta is onshore. So can you talk? Because I know that you were the supervisor of a lot of LLM theses that dealt with pollution there. Can you talk a little bit on that?
Yeah. So obviously Bodo, Nigeria was the site of probably one of the worst oil spills that we'd seen from an onshore onshore pipeline. And I mean, it was the pipeline, the actual pipeline itself. The reason why it ruptured was because it was 60 years old. So it was 60-year-old pipelines. So again, one has to question the actual or the actual controls in place, and the actual and the sustainability of trying to maintain something like that for that period of time. But yeah, so I mean, it was 2008, 2009. There was this 60-year-old pipeline which ruptured, and I think it spilt around 590,000 barrels, 1,000 barrels of oil into the ground. It's a lot of oil. Yeah, it's a lot of oil. And it was a lot of oil, and obviously the environment, the effects of it completely decimated the community, and decimated the livelihoods of the many people which lived there. Most of them relying on agriculture, and most of them relying on fishing.
That's the thing I noticed in my country. People just ignore the environmental impact of all exploration. Yes, people talk about environmental impact studies. They mention the environment, but it's completely ignored.
It's procedural. It is purely procedural. Yeah. It is purely procedural law, which can be circumnavigated, can be subject to corruption.
To basically be an advisor to one of these governments. What is going to be your recommendation in terms of action? What can we do to mitigate?
More in terms of the environmental impact assessment.
Yeah, in terms of the actions that governments should take to avoid that, because it's a big problem even in my country. And I think people are ignoring it. Even people from the industry, they barely mention environmental issues. It's mainly a procedural issue. It's not really a substantive issue.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the main problems is that it's very short. It's short-term thinking. That's why. Any problem which occurs where the environment suffers a detriment, you do have your short-term costs, but the overall recovery of the environment takes a much longer period. You think back to Exxon Valdez. Exxon Valdez was around 25 years before there were signs of real true recovery. So it needs to be, it needs to be longer thinking.
I studied Jackson Valdez, which was in 1988, in law and economics. I still remember. And still, I'm going to ask you about Deepwater Horizon, because
Macondo.
You were supposed to come to my students, and some of them are here in the chat, actually, watching you.
Excellent.
Because at the time, you didn't have time because Aaron, I think, was teaching, but for the future, Aaron, I'll invite him for the things. So can you talk a little bit about, before they ask us, a friend of mine asked us about the price of oil, but before we go there, I want to ask you about the Deepwater Horizon. I know, I mean, it completely transformed how people see the industry, how the industry see itself, and the impact for BP. It's devastating.
Yeah,
I don't advise people to go into BP stocks now, just because of that.
Yeah. I mean, the
$40 billion or 60.
It was.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, Exxon Valdez was purely. It was pure negligence. That was it. There was nothing like there was nothing overly complicated about the situation which occurred. It was pure negligence. Because what it was, that the drill that had been explored, or that was used to first explore the actual Macondo well, was the incorrect drill bit to be used for the extraction of the oil. It wasn't adequately tapped off. So the drill bit was left there. It wasn't tapped off properly. The pressure built up within the pipe because it was too narrow. The extraction pipe, because it was too narrow. The pressure builds up, and then boom, it goes up. There's a large explosion, and of course, which resulted in the huge oil spill that we see, the explosion, and obviously the fallout. I mean, I
remember that Obama created a presidential commission, and they had a report. And I remember that one of the conclusions was that there was a lot of regulatory failures. So that's one of the things I try to tell people in my own country, is that the regulation of oil and gas is not just about contracts. It's about everything. So in safety, it's a purview also of regulatory entities, whether it's an independent agency, whether it's a ministry, whether it's. Can you elaborate more? Because I think people just, not in Europe, but I mean, in developing countries, I see a lot of this action. Money first. Let's forget about it.
This is why. Sure. And I mean, this is why we see, like, or I mean, this is in particular, this was one of the topics which was covered when we had the conference about Guyana, is that it cannot be ultimately focused upon the money. You can't view, like, it's the equivalent to winning, like the discovery of oil and having oil and being an oil economy is akin to winning a lottery ticket. You have this ticket, you can do great things with it, but equally you can do very bad and you can do very foolish things with it. If you have the right guidance, if you have the right institutional framework in place, for lack of a better metaphor, if you have that right institutional framework in place, you can then use and spend that money and spend that money wisely. But yes, there has to be, as we said when we spoke about Ghana as well, there has to be a comprehensive framework in place in terms of actual, that covers the actual operations, and there has to be a comprehensive institutional framework in terms of directly addressing the governance. So looking at independent commissions that are focused purely on looking at environmental care, independent commissions looking at the actual operations themselves, and health and safety and such as well. These are issues which have to be paramount in sort of in the discussions and in the development of the sector on the whole, especially when it comes from a developing country where there could potentially be corruption.
Of corruption and participation of the stakeholder approach, because Aaron was responsible for the module of corporate social responsibility, and one of the things that Aaron focused, I remember, because in one semester I replaced you, was the stakeholder approach. Can you elaborate there as well?
Yeah, sure. So the stakeholder approach, the stakeholder approach then looks at, especially when it comes to social responsibility initiatives, looks at considering the wider sort of community, or the many different levels of people which engage with the community. So you're obviously, like, generally your stakeholder is anybody that engages with the company at any given level. So at any given level and any given time. So it could be anything. It could be a delivery company. It could be a company which operates a service contract to the company itself. So it could be anything. It could be anything small like that. And I mean, it needs to be, these are approaches which need to be taken.
Okay.
Because this idea that through the community and the environment are identified as stakeholders, where an organization is concerned, and this does form a part of CSR. And one of the truths is that even though community and environment form part of the corporate social responsibility, the triple bottom line, this idea of, we look at the economy, we look at the social, the economy, community, the social responsibility side of things, but also the environment, these obviously don't take as much prominence. And this is perhaps why there are many lawyers. Yeah.
Yes, I was having a discussion with a Portuguese lawyer today, and I think I told you on a text message, basically that most people are clueless about this idea of CSR and how the environment, how the community, how the economy interact with each other, and they assume that these things are absent from the debates about the future of the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, and this is the thing, because of this narrow approach, because of this narrow-minded approach to CSR. This is why if the oil industry, the oil and gas industry, adopted a broader approach to corporate social responsibility in this age of environmentalism, this is where it could yield benefits for their overall image, their overall and ultimately overall economics. Because let's face it, there is a rise in green thinking, and that has to be embraced. You can't ignore it, because you are merely like staving off the inevitable. It's coming. It's something that we have to.
I was watching a YouTube kind of a debate, which I hope we can do this in the future with top people line up where you can interview. And basically it was about the investment community and the Japan Pensions Fund, which is a fund that manages $1.7 trillion of pensions for Japanese public employees. And basically they embrace the ESG criteria, the environmental and social governance. Now it's part of their strategy. So if you as someone that look at the oil and gas industry just from a narrow perspective, believe me, you are going to disappear from the market.
Exactly. Yep.
Whether you are a country, whether you are a company. So these ideas are now mainstream. So this is something that we notice, particular work in developing countries. And by the way, Richard is asking, he's making a comment basically saying, Richard, he was our student in gas. He's saying that basically in developing countries, a regulatory framework exists in paper. And there is a lack of involvement of participants at all levels of process.
This is where it brings us back to the stakeholders.
Yeah, and he comes from the region. He's from the Niger Delta as well. So also, one of my cousins, she's actually she's saying that COVID-19 will enforce the demands for a new global responsibility. Do you agree with that? Do you think it will force us to think on these ideas, particularly in oil and gas and energy as a whole?
I mean, speaking as an idealist, I would say yes. I would say yes. Potentially there is, or it could form the catalyst for us as a general society to rethink our relationship with the environment and to rethink our relationship with general land use as well. And this is where the opportunity knocks for us to reevaluate this relationship. But one of the issues is that this is very heavily tied to political goals and political will. If the political will is there, then I think it will be a very good catalyst. You'll see changes in infrastructure. You'll see changes in the overall health, because I mean, let's face it, there will be reductions in pollutants because there's less motor vehicles on the road. But depending upon the government, depending upon what their goals and priorities are, this will depend upon how we see it moving forward. Like, for example, at the moment, well, we'll take the British government, for example. It's a complete clueless clown car of a government.
It's true. I gave them the benefit of the doubt in the beginning. I think we remember that, but now I think yes, they are just ruling.
No, absolute jokes. But this is the issue. On the one hand, they're saying we must get fitter as a nation. We must kickstart our new way of looking at life. We need to move, and we need to come out with a new outlook on life and society, and etc. This is all well and good, but the total fundage which has been allocated to each town and city where cycle lanes are concerned is the equivalent of something like 200 meters worth of cycling lanes. 200 meters, that's nothing. That is absolutely nothing. It's not even it's probably the length of one of my neighboring street here. That's it. One street gets a cycle lane. But it's ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. Then on the other hand, they're saying that no, you must ride bikes.
Just mention something on that. So with Brexit, how do you see UK and the EU diverging in terms of environmental and energy policy as a whole? Because this might be an issue in the future, no?
The UK will roll back energy policy. Will roll back. I think they will roll back environmental regulation. Because they are not even adopting, or they are against the level playing field approach that is being touted by the EU. The EU is saying you must adopt this level playing field in terms of workers' rights, environmental rights, etc., and environmental roles and responsibilities and such. But in terms of energy, the UK energy market moving forward is going to be very, very interesting. And this.
The Chinese, with the recent spat on Hong Kong, I know the Chinese are investing on 3 nuclear plants, 3.
Yes.
So Chinese investment. So how do you see that? Because obviously, I think nuclear makes sense for big countries with huge industrial needs, but up to a point. But many people in the environmental movement, which I'm environmental conscious. I don't consider myself like a Greenpeace activist, but I'm environmental conscious because it's a cost. It's a cost in terms for society. So you need to consider it.
Well, to be honest, I'm of a similar mind. I am of a similar mind, and that I think that nuclear, if you want to meet a completely renewable, clean energy target for,
particularly if you are a big country like UK, not a small country.
Exactly, big country, a lot of quite a dense population in certain areas. But we do. So I'm of the mind that nuclear is fine. Nuclear is fine. Obviously, there is this issue of nuclear waste which has to be dealt with. But I'm fairly certain we have the technology in which to do so. But also, I think this is the opportunity for us to invest in things like carbon capture technologies. Investing in carbon capture.
Can you talk a little bit about the opportunities? I think many of my friends that are going to watch this, because I'll try and download this video also and share it, so you can share it on LinkedIn and other platforms. Can you talk about the opportunities in terms? I'm a big. Although I'm an oil and gas guy, I love solar, and solar now it's competitive. Solar doesn't need any.
But what's quite interesting is, did you know that the average life of a solar cell is around 25 years?
No, that's huge. I thought it was like 10 or so.
No, 25 years. 25 years for a solar cell.
We need to build up a lot of solar farms and sell it in different markets.
There you go. But yeah, I mean, carbon capture.
Different
carbon capture and things like geoengineering and climate engineering again poses.
Can you explain to some of my audience, because most people, particularly in developing countries, have no clue about what carbon capture is or geoengineering?
Well, obviously, when carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere, it can then obviously it dissipates. But carbon capture is at the point in which it is then is then produced. It can then be captured and then turned into things like blocks. It can be turned into bricks, and it can be stored underground as a kind of geological formation. We can shove it underground, and it doesn't go into the atmosphere.
Can we do it just with the market, just looking at the private sector? Can you do it?
Believe it or not, but most of these, because I mean, this does fall within the area of climate engineering and geoengineering, and it is mostly the private sector which is exploring these technologies, because they have obviously the funding in which to develop such technologies. So it's interesting because it does once again provide this opportunity for the an interesting mix of public sector work and private sector work in order to meet the opportunities which are presented, but then also try and mitigate the negative consequences.
Okay, just to tell our audience that now there's a huge financial industry called impact investment that actually are looking for this type of projects. So you don't need government subsidies to actually do that. There's opportunities in the market. I know because do you remember our common friend, my former colleague from Oxford, Tara?
Yes, I do. Yes.
In impact investment, and I know that there are a lot of funds now that are chasing this market kind of environmental friendly projects and mitigation projects. Can you talk about solar? Because I'm a big proponent of solar, particularly for electricity, because one of the issues I see in Africa is that people use diesel. Diesel actually per megawatt, it's much more expensive than using solar. With no subsidy. So why do you think many of these countries in Africa are not adopting solar and are instead using the most expensive, usually imported fuels like diesel in
diesel
generators? Why, if solar is cheaper?
Because it's always an interesting discussion when people ask about kind of like the idea of setting up things like microgrids and using solar power. But the issue is truly when you see these companies that say, oh yes, we've provided these to this rural community, we've provided this solar power cell and this solar power battery, and they can do all these wonderful things with, now they've got solar power. But the issue is what they don't show you is, how is that maintained? Did they train anyone to maintain that equipment? That's the issue. That's the issue. And I think it's this idea, or within my own personal opinion, is that it is the idea that it's much easier to fix a mechanical diesel motor than it is to fix a complicated solar cell. Obviously, both can be done with training, but the mechanical sort of diesel generator, it's quite easy to fix. So that's my general feeling on that anyway. Or that's my general.
I think we need to create perhaps a startup on that and go heavily on solar. Because I think I told you, I went in 2016 in a conference in Oxford, and I saw a company called Copa, and the guys have 1 million clients. They don't need any government subsidies. They sell solar panels and a battery to the poorest of the poor in Kenya, in Uganda, and Tanzania, and it's basically an American company that is thriving in Africa. So I loved the business model. It was very, very interesting, and they're using like these digital payment systems, the M-Pesa. In Angola, most of these innovations, or in countries like the DRC and others, these innovations are still not there. I think it has to do with market access. Angola, it's a very closed economy. It's an economy where it's very difficult to go in unless you have a local partner that sometimes it's politically connected. I think that's one of the
and this is the issue. And it depends, and this is where it comes back to the previous discussion about looking at political interests. Again, if you look at we'll go back to Russia as an example here. If you look at the energy strategy to 2030, there was a greater emphasis on growing renewable energies within Russia. But you look at the energy strategy 2035, since there has been a greater engagement with China. And now natural gas has now taken prominence within their strategy to 2035. That is their gamble. Russia is focusing primarily upon the development of the gas industry, which geopolitically speaking is more favorable for them because it maintains the alliance with China, but also in terms of the commercial viability of the NSR and shipping LNG, it becomes better. Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask you something? Now, let's talk about the Gulf states, because usually I look a lot about what Saudi Arabia is doing, and I was looking at the recent financial statement and report. Obviously, I didn't look at the numbers. I look first at the strategy, at the vision, and then I look a little bit into the numbers. And I believe the uplift costs per barrel was about less than $3. It's amazing. It's probably the cheapest in the world. But I noticed that they are focusing on the petrochemical industry. They're also focusing on development of natural gas fields, and they have a few, and they are trying to develop also some shale. There's some shale potential that is under development, and they're trying to do that. But I also noticed that the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, they have it's where the headquarters of the International Renewable Energy Agency is, IRENA. It's based on Abu Dhabi. So how do you see the strategy being all producing countries, at least Abu Dhabi, not Dubai, but Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia? How do you see the strategy on solar? I know they have big plans on solar and renewable energy.
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting actually that we see them trying trying to diversify their energy mix, as it were. I think with Saudi Arabia, I think it's quite interesting. I think it's quite interesting to see them try and focus on petrochems rather than the actual production and supply of oil itself.
Yeah.
But they have to do it in order to survive and maintain.
Let me just give you a quick fact. Recently, Saudi Aramco just bought SABIC using the public investment funds. So now SABIC, which is the petrochemical conglomerate, now it's part of Saudi Aramco. They want to basically transform Saudi Aramco into a kind of an industrial company. It's a very interesting strategy.
Yeah, I think Saudi Aramco will probably end up being like Ineos, the British company with
chemical.
I think it'll be like Ineos. I think they'll be more focused on petrochems rather than anything else. But in terms of looking at their solar strategy, I mean, for the Middle East, it's something like the United Arab Emirates, especially. I think they want 25% by 2025. Say again.
Can they achieve that?
There's no reason why they can't. There's absolutely no reason why they can't, because they have the money and they have the means and the investment in which to do so. But I mean, as a whole,
they can hire the best people.
Yeah, they can hire the best people. If the global economy has taught us anything, and actions around the world have taught us anything, is that if you have more or less an unlimited amount of money, you can do whatever you please. You can do whatever you please. You can do whatever you want. But I mean, the UAE, I think it's 25 by 2025, but then by 2050, they're aiming for a 44% share in their energy mix of like renewables and solar. So. Okay. But it's interesting that they've read. I mean, the Gulf states in recent years, I think they are some of the lowest in terms of, like setting prices for solar power and things like that. I think they are the lowest. I think in terms of price per watt and price per megawatt and things like that.
I didn't know that. Okay. Can I ask you something on that? How do you think countries, that in Africa only 30 to 40% of people have access to electricity? And for me, working for investment in Angola, when I went back after my PhD, I noticed that one of the big issues is not just corruption, it's electricity. And basic. So if you want to set up a factory, people just use diesel generators. And it's expensive. So how can these countries bet more on solar, on renewables in general? How can they do that?
Foreign investment or entrepreneurs.
Okay.
There needs to be either a greater stimulus for entrepreneurial behavior, greater investment into things like technology. So companies, like national oil companies, say for example in Angola, they need to invest in things like educational programs, technology, education, the ground level. That's where it starts. The ground level education. You educate people, the
college level, before university.
Even from college level, college level. So you start people on things like mathematics, engineering. They get to things like university. They're already invested in a particular cause. They're already in a particular cause, because if you highlight problems to young people, they are going to solve those problems, because there is this idea that there is this thing that they are going to suffer detriments for perceived inequalities. So if there isn't security of supply, potentially there could be a young person right now in Angola who has an idea for a self-generating battery or mechanism or dynamo or something to that effect. So it starts at that level. It starts at the education. Educate either because it's either two choices. You either attract foreign investment or you educate for tomorrow. That's what you need.
Okay. Can I ask you something?
Yes.
It's a quick. This obviously it's not a talk about oil prices. Me and Aaron are going to invite top people in the future to our YouTube channel. So basically, or YouTube or another platform. Can you talk about oil prices? Because now this is basically, I invited you, so I want you to talk. How do you see oil prices after COVID? Obviously, there was a crash, basically, because of the demand that collapsed. Basically, it wiped out 1/3 of the demand. But how do you see oil and gas prices in the future, particularly for oil-depending economies? Because Angola now, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, Angola, it's going to have very, very rough situation, although it's still producing 1.2 million barrels of oil a day.
Yeah.
Most of this money goes to basically pay debt. So Angola is doing the over of debt. The debt ratio, it's going to be 123% this year. So the country can't invest, basically. It's basically using its own revenues to pay off debt, which is insane. It never happened in the last, I don't know, 20 years or more, or 30.
Yeah, or something. It's unprecedented. I think the time that actually, I don't like using the word unprecedented because it means it's completely unexpected and we don't know about this. But my opinion is that we have people researching these things.
How do you see oil prices in the near future, and what is the strategy for countries that are heavily reliant on oil, like Angola? By the way, I had a debate with a friend of mine. He works at Shell. I'm not sure if he's watching this. But one of the things I told him is that oil, as a percentage to the economy in terms of GDP, in Nigeria, it's about 8%.
Yeah.
Although it's the main source of revenues for government, for exports, it's only 8% of GDP. In Angola, it's probably half of that. Data I saw, it's about 50%. So Angola is probably the most heavily oil country in Africa, and one of the most in the world. So how do you see oil prices, and what is the strategy for countries like Angola and similar countries that are still heavily reliant on one product, which is oil?
Well, I mean, obviously, over the past, since March, I think Brent crude, just to use the benchmark, has dropped. I think it's around between 25 and 30%.
Huge.
So it's a huge drop. It is an absolutely huge drop. But one of the things is in terms of moving forward, I think as lockdown restrictions ease, as we find more people traveling, more people doing this, we'll get onto this in a second. The problem is that demand has dropped, and it will recover, but it won't recover as to the once dizzying heights of what we saw early last year, for example, before we had
about 100 million barrels of oil per day.
Yeah, but it won't. I don't think we'll see that. I do not think we'll see that, primarily because there has been such a decline in air travel. That's one of the major things. It's not so much the use of passenger vehicles. That's only a small percentage. Air travel makes up quite a lot of the percentage for demand. So with the reduction in passenger flights, and I think that will continue because the airlines won't have the income, the economics won't be there in order for them to sustain the use of certain planes. Like, for example, British Airways they have now sold all of their, well, not sold, but they have now retired all of their 747 planes. So they've now sold. So that's it. There is no more Boeing 747. And the problem is that they are running.
These are old airplanes with old airplanes.
But the problem is as well, because of all this business of social distancing and flying on planes where they are running at just like 40%, 50% capacity, economically, it's very, very bad for them. So they have to reduce flights. They have to reduce the number of flights. They have to reduce the number of flights per day. Reduce the flights over a number of routes, which of course impacts demand. Demand for oil. Demand for oil drops. So as a consequence, we won't see the return to dizzying heights. It will return. There will be a return, but I don't think it will be as high as it was. Now, in terms of what's next,
can I ask you something about diversification? What's your advice? I think we had a lot of debates on that. What's your advice?
Diversify.
Mozambique, Angola, like Nigeria. How can they diversify away from oil?
There needs to be a diversification, and it needs to be in things like tech. It needs to be tech. It needs to be AI. There needs to be this investment into the technological, away from or potentially things like fintech, away from oil. There needs to be a greater number of different exports in order to maintain
agriculture. So, for example, Angola has a lot of land which is just idle. A lot of agriculture is just subsistence agriculture. So the country still imports most of its food, which is ridiculous. But this is what's happening, and it's I would say in 2/3 of Africa, that's what's happening in 2/3 of the continent.
Yeah. But the problem is as well that 2/3 of the continent are also going to suffer the most detrimental consequences of climate change, which of course it comes back.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that? Because most people still think it's a hoax, which is ridiculous.
It's not a hoax, unfortunately.
Not most people, but most people from certain segments.
Yeah, I wish it was. I really do wish it was a hoax, but unfortunately it isn't.
Can I ask you something? I think you can safely say that developing countries are going to suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change.
They will, they will. So in terms of things like that, and these are going to exacerbate conflicts, potential conflicts that could arise. Climate changes or the effects of climate change are going to be a catalyst or a contributing factor to any sort of potential conflict which could occur, whether it's over water, whether it's over any sort of resource, land, forest. Anything like that, it's going to cause conflict.
Okay, just to wrap up, because we're going to continue these conversations in the future, because people are very interested in listening to you. So, our former student Nasteha, she's from Kenya originally. She's asking about nuclear energy in Africa. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because in terms of capital expenditures, I know it's very expensive. It's probably one of the most expensive ways, at least in terms of the initial investment for development of the plant. Can countries bet on that to tackle the electricity supply issues? Because only 30% of Africans have access to reliable electricity, which is
that's the problem. It's security of supply. That is the major problem. That is the major problem in Africa. Is security of supply. But one of the key things, and one of the ways in which that can be rectified, is of course with microgrids, solar power grids, and things like that. That's one of the ways in which it can be. In which it can be answered, but also there is a heavy degree of Chinese investment into into Africa at the moment. So China is bankrolling a number of different development projects in Africa.
Do you know how much Angola owes to China? Just let you know.
Go on.
$40 billion. It's the country with the largest, basically. So basically, Angola it's completely indebted. So a lot of our oil goes to China to pay off these loans, which nobody knows what kind of projects. Yes, we saw a lot of development from China, but a lot of these loans have some issues, and we need to understand how they were done. So some people are saying that nuclear shouldn't be an option. I have a different view. I think if you're a country like Nigeria with 200 million people, I think you cannot say I cannot have nuclear, because
I was of a similar mind, in which I said that nuclear, you can't have nuclear. You can't have nuclear. If you want to be environmentally friendly, you can't have nuclear. But the problem is if you want to address the overall impacts of climate change, if you want to mitigate this 1.5 to 2 degree rise, if you want to mitigate that and implement the necessary reductions, you need to switch to nuclear to have a baseline power. If you have that baseline of nuclear, that baseline supply of nuclear power,
particularly for a country like South Africa, which is the largest economy in the continent, a country like Nigeria, which is not the largest, but they're the two, and you have a large industrial base. I don't see how you can address climate change and just rely on renewables. One of the things I keep telling people in Portugal is that Portugal is not of the world. Portugal is a tiny country. You cannot just put solar and say, oh, I can do that in a country of 1 billion people like India.
Yeah, now we can run everything. You need a baseline power.
Yeah, and not every country has hydroelectrical power. If you're a small country, like
it's relatively safe as well. It is relatively safe.
Yeah, it's true. So I think people have this dread factor, and I think this is one of the reasons Germany electricity costs skyrocketed. By the way, when they retired their nuclear plants, they started to basically use coal-based power. It increased the emissions, and electricity costs went up. I think here we need to look at the energy trilemma. We need to look at which is something that was developed by the World Energy Council. It looks at environmental, at the costs, also looks at security of supply. So if you want to develop, you need electricity. Simple as that. It makes sense to put in the energy mix, not 100%, but perhaps 20, 10%. And you can also use nuclear for different countries. So for instance, you can create a electricity grid between 4 or 5 different countries, like many countries have, like in Northern Europe, like Portugal and Spain. In the EU, to be honest, the electricity markets are not very well developed as overall EU kind of a grid. So my view is that, you should consider it. Now, if you want not to consider it, I think you need to consider first the emissions, and second, the costs. Because electricity costs, it might be a big issue in Africa. In Africa, I believe in solar, wind, and hydroelectric. If you have the rivers, but some countries don't have enough rivers for to do that. So to wrap up, can you make some final comments?
Okay, so. As I said at the start, we find ourselves in a most interesting time in terms of how we can transition away from our reliance on fossil fuels and into something more greener. There are the opportunities there in terms of how we can address this, and climate change is no longer the elephant in the room. It's something that we have to embrace and something that we have to mitigate, because if we wait until the long term is going to cost us dearly compared to the short term. Short-term mitigation is less costly than the long-term adaptation. Adapting after. Prevention is the best form of us to adapt.
One of the things I noticed in Portugal and I noticed in the UK is that people are confusing many things. One of the things that they're confusing is that they don't understand that an energy policy for a developing country would naturally be different than for a mature country. Where a country like UK or Portugal, you cannot say to an African that uses I don't know, wood. Most Africans use wood as a significant source of energy, which is more polluting it's even less environmental friendly. So how can you address these different needs? Because different countries, different needs. The problem in Africa is that people don't even have electricity. This is the problem in Angola, where most people don't have electricity. That's why I've been proposing that we should use part of our natural gas.
Yeah.
And you might find a lot of natural gas more in the future, non-associated. We should use for electricity generation for internal development, not export it.
Because I mean, non-associated gas, obviously, it's either burned off or flared off, which many assignments that are submitted to me are always focused upon gas flaring and waste gases. Monetize it, use it. It's a resource. It is a resource which can be used. But again, to address the sort of smaller, micro level issues. The micro level issues in terms of like addressing individuals and individual requirements and what the individuals need. I think the best option is this idea then of using microgrids, using solar grids, using small scale batteries, and giving the training in which to maintain those.
Okay.
To think you create by using this and create this, you create an entirely new job market of professionals which are focused upon being able to fix solar panels.
Okay, let me ask you something. Natural gas.
Yes.
Will you feel better natural gas as the fuel of transition? What's your views in terms of strategy?
There should be none. I mean,
yes, ideally, but I mean,
ideally, but realistically speaking, it is going to be the bridge fuel away from like heavy reliance on fossil fuels. There is like the more developed nations will be able to accelerate their green transition, but for the developing nations, without the absence of things, without like subsidies, they will have to use natural gas as a transition while they develop, because let's face it, whenever it comes to climate change, whenever it comes to issues of environmental concern, there is always politics which play a huge part. Just think about the Kyoto Protocol and the US's objections to the Kyoto Protocol. They were worried about who was going to foot the bill. So they didn't want to foot the bill. They said, we're going to pay the most things. We don't want to foot the bill. Again, look at the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, Donald Trump, America's getting taken advantage of. It's a bad deal. We don't want that. We don't want that, etc., etc. And this is the problem, that it's a global. The issues that we face are global in their nature. We cannot be individuals in which we cannot be individuals, we cannot be individual states, we cannot be individual nations in order to address them. It needs a unified response to these problems. Otherwise, they won't get solved. They won't get solved. It will be constant. It will be a constant tug of war with the politics to it, and that's where it is.
Okay, just to finish up, there are a lot of things we covered a lot, and it's going to be quite difficult to cover everything. So one of the things is that this is one of the comments that Nastea did as well. It's about sustainable development. Do you think it's only a marketing phrase, or it's much more than that? Because I think it's much more than that. I think most people now want a clean environment, and you've seen a lot of these developing countries, particularly in my own country. You see a lot of cities with no planning, cities with a lot of air pollution, cities where you don't have this understanding about sustainable development and different pillars, and this increases our quality of life, even our psychological well-being. Can you talk a bit about that?
Just briefly then, I mean, sustainable development is full of noble intentions, but the problem is it's very easy to sell the narrative of success when there are larger changes needed. When there are larger changes needed and a greater degree of changes needed, it's quite easy to sell these increments as a huge success and say, look how brilliant we are as a nation, even though we've just kicked 30 gallons of toxic waste over this lovely green vegetation area. So it is quite interesting. I mean, as a concept, some people do Some people do laud it as the be all and end all, but I tend to think of like sustainable development and this idea of and the sustainable development goals. They are more of a they are more of a set of guidelines, like kind of like the Stockholm Declaration and the Rio Declaration, key principles in which broad guidelines in which, if implemented, are essentially ways forward for you to live a greener and more environmentally friendly future.
Okay, just to wrap up, there's a lot that we can talk about. So,
of course.
So I just want to ask you about the future in terms of teaching of energy, oil and gas, because I keep talking about with different people. I think people completely misunderstand what oil and gas is and how you can approach it. Can you talk about how we understood oil and gas, what was our vision for the program? Because this is something I keep need to explain the basics to people that I think should have already know the basics, that it's about everything. It's about the environment. It's about anti-corruption. It's about governance. It's about even corporate governance. It's about everything. And politics also plays a role because
it plays a huge part.
So can you talk a little bit about that? Because this is something I tried to explain in Portugal to my students in the 2 years. Also in Africa, I'm not sure if people really got the message about what I was trying to say in terms of, because I'm an oil and gas person, but I look at the future, and the future will increase renewables, will have care for the environment, and the fossils will decrease, and that's our goal, and that's a good thing, because we want a more sustainable kind of a development and energy type of consumption. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Sure. So just to wrap up then. I mean, one of the key things, or one of the changes, I mean, obviously our philosophy when we were teaching oil and gas is that you have to take a holistic perspective to it. You have to look at the big picture. You can't look at narrow individual like small holes and boxes as to as to how different things operate, because you need to explain the connections between the two. If there is an accident, for example, what regulation is in place there? What are the consequences of that? If the consequences are environmental, okay, what environmental regulation has been contravened? And then again, okay, how do we look at compensating those people for the environmental consequence they have suffered, or the detrimental consequences they have suffered? But yes, like you say, it because of the nature of the oil and gas, where it comes from, it's connected to many different areas, many different disciplines. So, and in order to develop a fuller understanding of the industry as a whole, you need to have an understanding of these different areas and how they interrelate. So you need to understand the governance. You need to understand the politics. You need to understand the relationship to the environment. You are operating within the environment to which your customers, your consumers live. If your environment if the environment is polluted, if the environment is damaged beyond all control, how on earth can your consumers and your stakeholders, how on earth can they continue to engage with you as a stakeholder? So we have a responsibility to we have a responsibility to these stakeholders to ensure that environment is adequately protected. So there we go.
Okay, Aaron, I want to thank you.
You're most welcome.
It was an amazing talk. I'm getting a lot of feedback, informal and informal. Some people are going to watch this later as well. I'll send you the link, see if I can download this, so you can also, we can use in our platforms on LinkedIn, because this was just a kind of a test pilot. And I want to thank you, and hopefully lead from here to future talks and to future projects as well, and involve more people from Coventry or outside Coventry, because I had amazing years, and thank God I left on good terms, I think.
For sure.
I wasn't fired, just to tell people. I left on good terms, and I think Coventry, it's a city that also demonstrates this idea of being international, because for the people that don't know, Coventry was bombed by the Germans in Second World War II, so it was completely devastated. So it was reborn. Let's put it. Coventry, it's a city that demonstrates the importance of international of cooperation. This is something that I really like about the UK, was this tradition not of isolation, but more of an international kind of cooperation. So Aaron, so now there's a new challenge, and the challenge is that we should perhaps put this into YouTube channel and invite people. I think people are very interested, even top people are very interested in giving their opinions. So, and this talk was amazing. The feedback was very good.
Excellent.
And I hope that my Portuguese students that are going to watch this, and students from Africa as well, and from different parts of the world, like Latin America, and even my partner here from Ecuador, because I have a partnership with an Ecuadorian law firm here, and he gave me some feedback, and people loved you, basically, in terms of the feedback. So thank you again, Aaron, and let's talk soon. And hopefully the challenge now is to bring more people and try and see if we can create more kind of synergies, so we can talk about oil and gas, energy, the environment on a more holistic view. And that's my view.
Excellent.
And yours was never just oil and gas and oil contracts or rotation. Was more broader. And I think most people miss this, unfortunately, because it's only a semester, which I taught here in Portugal. So it wasn't a kind of oil and gas kind of LLM. So the challenge is there. So let's do it. So thank you again, Aaron, for the interview.
Take care.
And for the talk. And hopefully let's share this on LinkedIn. I think the impact is going to be even wider. And I'm going to share this talk. So thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Right. See you later, guys.